Hello, everyone. My name is Lily Bronner. I'm a third-year undergraduate majoring in linguistics and computer science and minoring in data science engineering. And this project is part of my honors thesis in linguistics advised by Professor Ethan Poole. Today, I'll be presenting a portion of my project probing the patient-theme distinction in Ilokano ditransitives. This project asks how Ilokano structures sentences with two object-like participants, as in the man put the vase on the pedestal, where the vase and the pedestal are both objects, and whether those participants have a fixed hierarchy or a more flexible relationship between them. I test this using binding, where one phrase helps determine the interpretation of another, as in every vase and its pedestal, which are very closely related. Ilocano is a Philippine language spoken primarily in northern Luzon. It has around 11 million current speakers and is widely spoken as a second language both in the Philippines and throughout the Filipinx diaspora. On the map, I've marked Laoag City in Ilocos Norte, which is a major center of the Ilocano-speaking region, and Quezon City in Metro Manila for broader context geographically. Compared to other Philippine languages, like Tagalog and Cebuano, Ilocano remains relatively understudied in syntax. So this project is both descriptive and theoretical. It contributes to our understanding of Ilocano while also using it to ask broader questions about how languages structure their arguments. To understand the question, we need some background on Austronesian voice. Many Austronesian languages, including Philippine languages, have a rich voice system where the form of the verb changes depending on which participant in the sentence has a special grammatical status. A rough English comparison to this would be the active-passive distinction. In the sentence, the cat chased the mouse, you can see that the cat is the subject, but in the mouse was chased by the cat, the subject shifts to the mouse. Ilocano doesn't work exactly like the English passive, but the comparison shows this sort of general idea. Languages can grammatically reorganize which participant is most prominent. And in Ilocano, that prominence is reflected through verbal morphology, case marking, and the special role of one argument called the pivot. The pivot is the argument that receives this special grammatical status. In Ilocano, the pivot affects what can be questioned, extracted, moved, or even marked in particular ways. And the important point here is that the verb morphology tells us which participant is being treated as the pivot in the sentence. In the first example, sino tinagsurat iti libro, meaning who wrote the book, the question phrase is the actor, and the actor is the pivot. You're asking who. The verb uses actor voice morphology, marked by nag, to indicate this. And in the second example, anyati pinangsurat ni Mark, meaning what did Mark write with? The question phrase is the instrument, not the person. So the verb uses instrumental voice, pinang, instead. That's why Austronesian voice is syntactically so important. Different voice forms are often understood as targeting different kinds of arguments, like actors, themes, locations, or instruments. And that expectation becomes important once we look beyond the pivot. We can sort of see the importance of this alignment when it fails. The first sentence, which we saw on the previous page, is grammatical because the actor is questioned and the verb uses corresponding actor morphology. But the second sentence is not acceptable with this intended meaning of who wrote the book, because it tries to question the actor while showing instrumental voice instead. It tries to ask who when you're really talking about a thing. So the pivot and the voice morphology need to align. And this matters methodologically. Since the pivot has special grammatical privileges, pivot behavior can obscure what's happening elsewhere in the sentence. So my project asks what we can learn by looking beyond this sort of pivot domain, specifically at the relationship between two arguments that are both non-pivots. Ditransitive sentences give us a way to do that. A ditransitive sentence has more than one internal argument. So in English, examples include like, I gave the child a gift, or I put the vase on the pedestal, which we'll get very familiar with. The Ilocano sentence shown here, Mangkikabilto ti lalaki iti vase iti pedestal, has the meaning the man will put the vase on the pedestal. So the vase and the pedestal are objects. The actor, ti lalaki, is the pivot because the sentence is in actor voice. But the sentence also contains these two non-pivot arguments, iti vase and iti pedestal. That gives us this central question: how are these two non-pivots related to each other? One possibility could be that there's a fixed hierarchy where one semantic role is always structurally higher than the other. But another possibility is that the relationship is more flexible. So the question is not only whether the two non-pivots are ordered, it's whether the semantic distinctions that matter for voice, like patient, theme, location, and others, still correspond to fixed syntactic positions when those arguments are not the pivot. Binding gives us a way to test that. This slide shows some of the core data from my project. In the first sentence, Mangkikabilto ti lalaki iti tunggal vase iti pedestal na, the meaning is the man will put every vase on its pedestal. Here, tanggal vase, meaning every vase, comes before pedestal na, meaning its pedestal. The pronoun na, meaning its, can depend on every vase. In other words, for each vase, there is a corresponding pedestal. They're linked. That result is compatible with a structure where the first non-pivot is higher than the second, since binding is often taken to reflect this structural relationship between the binder and the pronoun. But the more important result here is the second sentence. Mangkikabilto ti lalaki iti pedestal na iti tanggal vase. Here, its pedestal comes before every vase. And if binding simply followed surface order, we wouldn't expect that this later quantifier would be able to bind the earlier pronoun. But a native speaker accepted the sentence with the same intended meaning. The man will put every vase on its pedestal. It's just as well and good as the previous one. So the binding relationship cannot be reduced to surface order alone. Complicating this further is that the same pattern also holds in the reverse semantic direction. Every pedestal can bind its vase, and this is accepted in both object orders as well. That's the key finding here. The two non-pivot arguments allow binding in both directions. I call this symmetric because neither argument behaves as though it must always occupy the structurally privileged position, which is interesting. This pattern rules out the simplest fixed hierarchy analysis here. If Ilokano required one non-pivot argument, for example, the patient, to always be structurally higher than the other, then we wouldn't expect binding to work equally well in both directions. But we see that it does. So the data doesn't really force a single analysis. One possibility is flexible binary branching. Under this view, the structure is still built in these binary components, but either non-pivot can be introduced higher depending on the sentence. This preserves the nature of binary branching, which is seen as fundamental in current minimalist syntax. But it begs the question of why this voice system is so complicated. If voice morphology is often analyzed as targeting particular kinds of arguments, like the patient and the theme, then symmetric non-pivot behavior suggests that those role distinctions might not correspond to a fixed syntactic position. That way, the question kind of shifts. If these non-pivots can be structurally reordered, how do we distinguish the voice types that are supposed to target them? And this is especially interesting in Ilokano, where non-pivot movement is otherwise very, very restricted. A second possibility is a flatter structure, where the two non-pivots are introduced at the same level. That would be much more disruptive to the status quo, as so-called in syntax, because it challenges the assumption that syntactic structure must be strictly binary branching. But the data create an analytical choice here. Either Ilokano has the flexibility within the binary structure, or the non-pivot domain might involve something that's more symmetric. The broader implication here is that Austronesian voice is not only about which argument becomes the pivot. The pivot is central to some conversations, yes, but the non-pivot domain also contains syntactic information that can challenge our assumptions about argument structure. The Ilokano data suggests that non-pivot arguments behave more symmetrically than a simple hierarchy would predict. That matters because patient, theme, and related distinctions are often treated as syntactically meaningful. But these results suggest that they might not always map neatly onto fixed structural positions like we would have previously assumed. I have also tested additional diagnostics, including reflexives, reciprocals, and other ditransitive verbs, but the binding data shown here is just the cleanest part of that larger pattern. Future work is needed to test how consistent the symmetry is across speakers, verbs, and syntactic environments. But the next stage of it is not simply asking whether or not some symmetric binding exists. It's asking what that symmetry actually reveals about the architecture of Ilokano clause structure and how much flexibility syntax should allow in the non-pivot domain. Ultimately, this project suggests that internal argument structure is not syntactic background noise. It's a place where Ilokano may reveal flexibility that's easy to miss if we only study the pivot. More broadly, I hope this project contributes to work on Austronesian languages that does not treat them as interchangeable, but instead takes seriously the unique syntactic considerations that individual languages like Ilokano can raise. Finally, I want to thank my Ilokano consultant and grandmother, Erlinda Rivera Almoral, for sharing her language with me and for putting up with me these past 20 years. This project is very meaningful for me because Ilokano is part of my family history, and working on this project has allowed me to connect my own interest to my heritage. I would also like to thank my mentor, Professor Ethan Poole, for his guidance throughout this project, which has been completely invaluable. Thank you.